Welcome to the Private Capital Podcast. I'm Joe Riley, head of Circulus Group, which is a forum for the family office world. Today we're doing something a bit fun, but well within the mission of this podcast, which is to examine investment decision-making. We're talking to Carin-Isabel Knoop, who is the founder and executive director of the Harvard Business School Research and Case Writing Division. This is a similar conversation to the great one I had last year with Paul Edelman, who has developed psychological tests to find talent for leading hedge funds. I'd encourage you to listen to that one if you haven't. Paul is great at breaking down conceptual thinking. Today's conversation was spurred by two things. One, that I found out on the Business Breakdowns podcast last year, that Harvard Business School publishing is larger than Forbes. And two, I've just always been curious about how case studies are actually written. Anyone who has done security or competitive analysis will appreciate the level of details that go into a case. Cases are used to teach decision-making and business reasoning for analysts, business owners, consultants, and investors, but what are the decisions that go into the cases themselves, and why are they such a good tool for teaching this mode of thought? What I found was intriguing and in some ways pleasantly surprising, and Carin was great fun to talk to. Carin-Isabel Knoop is the executive director of the Harvard Business School Case Research and Writing Group, which she began in 1995. Previously, she was a consultant at McKinsey and PricewaterhouseCoopers. Carin has her bachelor's summa cum laude in government, economics, and international relations from the University of Texas at Austin, and an MBA from Harvard Business School with honors. She's also a very active writer on Medium, where she writes about creating better workplaces.
This podcast is for educational and entertainment purposes only. Anything said by the guests or host should not be construed as legal or investment advice. Thanks for listening.
I usually just like to start with people's background.
I'm half French, half German, and I grew up in Mexico. We grew up a little bit all over the place. My father worked in the Foreign Service. My parents came from very different environments. My mother's family was in the French sort of state. My father grew up in a rural environment. So I grew up from very different people, different social classes, different religions. And I came to the US a little bit by a fluke. My mother suddenly decided to move there, went to the University of Texas. And then I came back to Europe actually for a few years before deciding to come to do an MBA. Before the MBA, I was in Central Europe. I worked at Coopers & Lybrand actually in corporate finance, and so was really a little bit on the front row of the transformation that occurred in Eastern and Central Europe. And I got to witness the shock on people, the impact that it had, and also how resilient and quick some people were to suddenly change from one system to another. So I became very interested in thinking about business more systematically, applied to business school. And then in business school really got a bug for research and the case method. Stayed originally to do a PhD and decided that actually it was more the research side that interested me. And so I was lucky enough to set up a case research and writing team, first in executive education, and now we support about a third of the school's cases. So I was all over the place for a while, Joe, and then I basically haven't moved for 32 years. I can see my dorm room window from my office. So I don't know if that's cool or really lame, but that's what it is.
And when did that division start? That was like 2000?
A little bit earlier, so I'm class of 94 at Harvard Business School. And first I was in executive education working on programs for company-specific needs. So a company would come and say, I'd really like to think about training my high potential folks. So we did that for a while. And then out of there came the notion that there might be a way to organize research slightly differently at HBS. It used to be that individual faculty members would have their individual research associates. But having had a past in consulting, I thought that this could be done differently and that we could set up a semi-professional team that could support people on a project-by-project basis, much like as you have the analyst in a consulting firm. So we started that in exec ed, and then in 1999, so you're correct on your chronology, that's when we came out of exec ed to support the entire work of the school. So we work for all the programs and mostly for faculty, mostly on case studies and mostly on field case studies, which involve company visits and interviews with practitioners.
How do cases fit into the larger academic effort? Does tenure depend on case writing?
Harvard Business School started officially in 1908, which is actually before the official case study as we know it began, which is then in 1921. I would say that the founding of the school responded to a need to professionalize business, and that the case method and its adoption and its now dominance came later. A central tenet, I think, of a school like Harvard Business School is proximity to practice. And the case method not only gives you proximity to practice, but it also insists on a classroom that is Socratic and that is participant-based learning. One of the ways that admission picks people is to make sure that they will add to the diversity of thought and expression in a classroom, that they would have different geographic points of views. So teaching by the case method is not just central to the classroom, it's really central to how faculty learn and develop. Faculty will have ideas about research that they want to do, and they might go and write a couple of cases on the topic. That will in turn inform their research. They will write a paper. There'll be practitioner reactions to the paper. Then they will go and write the next set of cases. So it's absolutely central, I think, not just to faculty development and to teaching, but also to this proximity to practice. I'm not a faculty member, so the tenure process is not one that I'm intimately familiar with, but having written cases and also having written teaching notes that are basically instruction guides on how do you use cases in the classroom, I think is a central part of having tenure at Harvard Business School. There may be lateral hires that will not be tenured, that do not have this requirement, but even visiting professors will tend to write cases. People who might be coming over as full professors from other universities will usually roll up their sleeves and be excited to write cases. So it's really central to the life of being a faculty member at the school, I would say.
Do you try to rate limit the number of cases that get written in a particular subdiscipline? Is there any thought to the types of cases that get written overall? I guess like you wouldn't want to have all the cases this year are on healthcare, all the cases this year are on strategy, et cetera.
So the faculty is composed of individuals passionate about their world, and they want to be I'd say, as it did a few decades ago, let's be more intentional on having cases featuring women protagonists. Let's be more intentional on setting up research offices all over the world to make sure that we learn from how business is done in other parts of the world. There's been a push towards greater representation of protagonist backgrounds. So you will see these desires to think about how do we learn more broadly and more globally across different types of protagonists. I think that would be, it's not a push, but it's an encouragement. I think then you also have the response of people in the classrooms and in executive education. If a set of cases doesn't really work in the classroom, they'll get retired and new ones will come. So there's a natural rejuvenation of the catalog, which then will reflect issues that may be more contemporary. So when I started writing cases 30 years ago, actually my very first case was on recycling. So I wrote for faculty members, but I was very early in his concern for climate change. But now we write a lot of them because it is what business is preoccupied about. So the evolution is not directed, Joe, I think. It's really organic and a reflection of how society evolves and how the school wishes to live by its values.
And where do learning objectives come in? Are cases taught in a progression? Is there easy cases, hard cases?
So there are several kinds of programs at the business school. One is the MBA program, and the others are executive education. So I'll focus on the MBA program for a start. The MBA has two big parts, the first year and the second year. The first year, which is a required curriculum, is really there to give everybody a basic understanding of various topics. And so you're going to be seeing technology and operations management, the entrepreneurial manager, finance, strategy, lead, business in the global economy, leadership and corporate accountability. And the idea is that everybody will go through that first year. So even if you're a god of finance, you would go through that first year. Because first, we rely on you contributing in the classroom and helping your classmates, but also you will actually learn from interacting with people who might have a different understanding of finance than you have, as you probably will in life. These cases, I think you use the word basic, these cases tend to be there for skill building. When you're thinking of a product like a vaping product, who are your constituents? What is the framework you must have in mind? In strategy, how do you apply the 5 forces? In marketing, what are your 5 Ps or 6 Ps? The idea is that people would emerge from that first year with this kind of basic understanding. The second year, which is called the elective curriculum, has students picking their courses. Those cases typically are reflections of the research and passion of the faculty teaching that course. There you will have cases that are less focused on skill building because the students will have had their basic skills, but they're more integrative, which is, okay, so you understand strategy, you understand leadership and corporate accountability, you understand that your company is in a global system. So what do you do now? How do you actually trade off these different frameworks that you've learned? How do you apply them in a more holistic way? These cases would be more integrated compared to the others. And then you have executive education where you're teaching people who have been in business for a while. You might assume a certain set of skills. And those cases might be less basic. You might not have somebody calculating the weighted average cost of capital. You might have them really delve into immediately a corporate strategy case.
So let's get down to basics. How does a case originate?
It comes from two ways. One might be you're a faculty member and you have just joined. You're teaching in the required curriculum, so that first year that I mentioned, and we would like to give you an opportunity to write a case that replaces an older case. A senior faculty member would be partnered with you, and she might have a contact, or you might have an idea or a contact, and then you would be writing that case for this particular reason. It may be that you read a story in the newspaper that is really compelling, and you reached out to the individual and you say, Joe, we'd really like to write about this decision that you had to take. Would this be something we could discuss? Some case leads also occur inbound, which is you would call me and say, Carin, I'm facing this dilemma. I'm wondering whether it would be an interesting case. And then you and I would have a conversation around, is it interesting to you, but is it universally relevant? Are you willing to share data? Are you willing to have your management spend time with us, etc.? So there'd be some contracting. And then the fourth type would be, especially for that second year, a faculty member has done research in a particular area, let's say how CEOs spend their time. And she really needs a case that is on a CEO going through a merger. So then she would scan her network, scan the news, scan the research, and then come up with a case that would illustrate the research concept that she wishes to embody. So they come in many different ways.
But you only have so much capacity. So how do you know what will make a good case? Does this work like a publisher? Do editors decide which ones they'll move forward with and which ones they won't?
No, it's all the faculty decision. So a faculty will, of course, when you go into a situation, it may be that you expect the case to be about succession, and you go in and you realize actually they've solved the succession issue. And so that might be a time when the faculty will say, this is not going to serve my research needs nor my teaching needs. And so he might exit. It might be that you go in wishing to write about succession, and the company says, actually, you know what we're really struggling with is product market fit. And it might be that the faculty member has a place for a case like that, or it may be a case for a colleague of his. And so they might say, Joe, I'm not the person, this is not a good case from my course, but I'll introduce you to one of my colleagues and maybe it will work out. So it's very organic. There's no editing, no gate, no decision. It is the faculty understanding about what matters to business and society that will drive the cases that get written.
So everybody I told about this interview told me to ask how you folks get so much access. So, for example, you did a great case on the Carlyle group, famously secretive group. Mm-hmm. And a lot of these cases refer to internal corporate documents. They talk about internal memos. They use real numbers. How do the case writers get so much access?
trust, I would say, which is decades of being very careful about engaging with potential protagonists with a great deal of care. We know that we write about their lives, sometimes their careers. We're taking their time when we write, and so we want to be as respectful as possible. There's a very careful contracting process at the beginning where we are explicit about the time this might take. And particularly important is this notion of we are not journalists, we're not analysts. The faculty members are really there trying to understand a problem, and they really want to learn from the case situation. So I think transmitting that respect. The cases also, when we write about companies, they have the right of refusal. So there is a formal authorization process at the end. So if we wind up writing a case that no longer feels comfortable to you as a case protagonist, or let's say you're going to a dark period because there is an impending buyout, then we would throw the case away and move on. So there's control on the part of the company at the end about what gets released. And companies look over the drafts to make sure that we haven't made a mistake, to make sure that things are properly represented, and they might have some edits. So it's a partnership in presenting the dilemma that they're facing. We write on a lot of alumni. One advantage that we have is that it's a very big school, a very big class, a lot of executives. They come back and have ideas. So often you will be interviewing somebody who has familiarity with the case methods. So they know that I'm not here to write a press release on you. They know that I'm not here to write social media copy to make you look good. They know that I'm there to understand what is happening so that other people in the classroom can wrestle with your dilemma. So that helps when people have an understanding of what is happening. And then finally, it is exciting for people to have cases written on them. Often they're about situations that were hard for the company. And having people come in and say, so how did you do? What did you feel? Can feel a little bit like the upstream of consulting without the slide decks, without the bill. It's talking to brilliant minds of business about what you're dealing with. And so I think a lot of case protagonists tell us how much they benefited from engaging with our faculty members.
But there's still probably there are time management discussions that you have to have there. So if I'm hiring McKinsey, I'm obviously paying them a lot of money. I'm going to make sure that my employees are available. But how do you folks negotiate that?
For the most part, usually there is one central contact. The approval has to come at a high level. So it has to be somebody who is senior enough to be able to sign the release form, but also close enough to the action to be able to vouch for it, right? So there is another element of sort of trust and control. And then the company will decide whom we are to meet. And then a faculty member would say, that's great, but I actually would like to talk to a factory worker to see what it actually felt like. What did the change feel like for these individuals? And it would be nice if we could also talk to a supplier. And the company might say, that's fine, we'll broker that contact. The company might say, we're not comfortable with you doing that. Then the faculty would explain why. So it would be a collaborative process. For the most part, when we go into interviews, we've done the primary research, we have an interview guide. We're going to try to be as efficient as possible because we understand that folks in organizations, public, private, public sector organizations have a lot of stuff to do.
And what's the average timeline?
So it can range. I would say that a case start to finish 3 months would probably be great. It takes a little while to get going. You will go to interviews, you will iterate. It will take a while to be reviewed. When push comes to shove, we've written cases on much less time. And sometimes cases take 2 or 3 years because the company is not ready to release, the faculty may be on leave or teaching, and then suddenly they get released and it's like Christmas.
You have this wonderful quote. You said it's a weird combination of skills. You're looking for conflict and presenting it in a way that generates friction but no fire. What are these interviews like?
The interviews tend to be, of course, people will be guarded, but I think explaining to the interview why you are there really helps, which is if we write a case about your company that makes you look great and there's no tension, the students will hate it. So they're going to be distracted in the classroom because they're not going to consider it worthy of their time, which is 80 minutes time, 800 people. It's a huge investment in human capital. A lot of these students pay their own tuition or are beneficiaries of financial aid, all very precious goods. And so the more explicit we can be about the fact that we are not there to cause trouble, but that we want to represent how hard it has been to actually implement some of these decisions. So let's say you're in a company and the company is very committed to doing something against climate change, but you're a middle manager and your kid at home is torturing you, but you're a middle manager and you still want to have your bonus at the end. You're still going to have to execute on what the company wants you to do. The more explicit you can be about how hard it actually is to live the values of an organization day in, day out, the better the case. Because then the people reading the case will be like, wow, it's an organization where people feel comfortable sharing their challenges and how they think about it, so that I can think about how will I manage these frictions in the workplace? How will I think about helping people through them? Often there's tension just in the situation of the case. Also, there's a decision to be made. We might talk to somebody in marketing that might have a different opinion from production. So we want to create teaching materials that enable students to debate and learn from each other and create heat. But we also don't want to create documents that lead people too much that then conversations sort of degenerate, which is, of course, this company is evil. Or, of course, was the good idea to do. So it's it's a great skill that faculty have to walk that line.
So before you start building the case, is there a framework that you have in mind beforehand? You have the 5 forces, or do you have a meeting where you discuss and try to outline the case, or do you go in there and try to learn on the fly?
So much as faculty have their own areas of passion and styles, they'll bring their own individuality to case writing. Also, depending on the nature of the cases that they are writing. For example, am I writing a replacement case or am I writing a completely new case? Everything, we've been focused on sort of the production of the 11 to 15 pages, the case itself. But what we're really talking about here is the case method. And the case method is what occurs in the classroom. The faculty will start from the classroom backwards, which is at the end of the class, what do I want Joe to remember? What are the 3 things he needs to know? How will my boards look like? There are 6 boards in the HBS classrooms. They move up and down. That's a lot of territory for folks to visualize how things interrelate and how we might be grouping them in categories. In order for me to get to Joe's emerging with 3 takeaways and 2 new skills and the boards, I need to go backwards, work backwards. And that's the job of the case writer, is to help faculty members do that. Once you know the pedagogical destination, it's a lot easier to build the path to it. And then assume that I want to have these 3 takeaways. You will tell the case writer, these are going to be my 3 main topics. So when we interview, I'll be asking about these 3 topics. The exhibits will be related to these 3 topics. And then you go from there. So you work backwards first from the classroom and your pedagogical objectives. And then when you get to the company, they're going like salmons the other way. They're telling the story usually from now backwards. And so it's a fascinating process of reconciling both. The other conversation that is very explicit with the companies too is that in 11 pages, I cannot tell everything about the history of your company, the evolution of US healthcare, regulations, opioids. We're going to have to make choices around what we present. So the making of these choices make case writing, I think, particularly intellectually stimulating.
My experience with consulting is that you always find, just like you said, there's multiple narratives and you have to decide what to leave in and what to leave out. But also there's a certain prioritizing. You usually have some sort of a job that you're trying to get done or something you're trying to accomplish. Mm-hmm. How do you decide in a process what to leave in and what to leave out?
So that's an excellent question. Always getting back to how is this going to work in the classroom and how, so the you here being, I'll speak as a case writer. My you here will be like, what is my faculty trying to teach? And what are the fewest possible words I can use to get them there? And what are the choices that I can make based on what I know they want to teach, based on what I think the company is willing to share, and what is important in this, what framework I might have to get there? We have a very global audience. I think 70% of our executive education participants are non-native English speakers. There are a lot of non-native English speakers in the MBA program. I was one of them. Another choice you make is, can you leave out things that are extraneous? Can you write as simply and as clearly as possible? So there's an economy of words that is a choice. And then sometimes there are choices that may be related to a particular, something that is needed for the case. So let me give you an example. There may be a case where the protagonist's background is particularly relevant to the situation they're facing. When I speak with people who are mental health advocates, you will often find out that they have a personal sort of history or family history, or there's a story there that led them to this time. This could be relevant, for example, in a case for somebody who has started a mental health app. That background may not be relevant if I'm writing about them launching a blue coat factory, for example. So there's a choice that gets made also about what about the protagonist do I need to include that reflects the humanity of that person if it's relevant. The first set of my choices were cutting and getting out. And then sometimes there are a set of choices about what do I need to make sure that I include actively for the case to work in class. It's a process of iteration, Joe. Faculty members will go through the drafts. They will rewrite it. They will say more of this, less of that. And sometimes in reading a first draft, a faculty member might say, this is really interesting. I didn't know this background, but it's not really relevant. Let's take it out. But the faculty member will still remember that background when they're prepping for the case or doing another case or writing a research project. So even in the editing and whatever winds up on the editing floor often has a value.
Do cases ever go completely off the rails and get scrapped?
So hopefully not too much off the rails, and we would have to define that, what you mean by that. So I mentioned that sometimes companies might be bought. The new owner might not appreciate. Protagonists are people too. They resign, they change their minds, they get promoted, they get told by their bosses that was a great idea 6 months ago, I don't like it anymore. It happens, and our team keeps track of these instances because we stop working on them. It happens very rarely, thankfully. And sometimes it might not be the right time, right? Maybe we wrote on your company or family business, and we would have a conversation with the family, and the family would say, why don't we wait 6 months until our granddaughter is out of college? And then that would be a better timing for our family for a host of reasons, once she made a professional choice, let's say. And then the faculty will say, of course, we'll wait. The faculty might say, it's really disappointing because I had this perfect families in business program in executive education. You would learn so much from coming to class, interacting with people, watching us teach. Can you allow us to use it just one-time use? So not sold to the outside world, and then we will release it when your granddaughter is out. So again, it's really a conversation. We want this to be as productive and beneficial as possible to the organizations we learn from, in the hope that they will learn from the experience also. So it's really a give and take and a conversation.
Would you mind taking us through a case that you worked on, maybe briefly discuss one of your favorites?
Yes, of course. Thank you for asking. Of course, I'm going to tell you that they're all my favorites. I cannot have favorite children. And I really do. I am excited to be paid to learn. It's a phenomenal job. But one case that was close to my heart were actually a pair of cases that we did in the pandemic around mental health and post-traumatic resilience, in part because we've been very reluctant to talk about mental health at work, even though we all know that we're humans, but it wasn't really there's so much stigma, people didn't want to speak about it. And then Professor Boris Groisberg had the courage to actually reach out and write 2 cases. So they happened to be 2 athletes, but very, very different sort of career presentations, Michael Phelps and Vladimir Klitschko. And the cases there were a process of the faculty deciding how would he use these cases about 2 individuals who had been open about the importance of mental health to their success. So Michael Phelps has been open. He has also been open because he has been in the news for driving under the influence and challenges. And he was willing to tell the arc of his life, of his success, of how challenging success had been to him. So the cost of success. Extremely open. We spoke to his family members, to his coach, to his wife. So you really developed a 360 view of an individual, an extremely high performer. And so when you think of CEOs, when you think of founders, business leaders, politicians, their success has come as a great cost. And so this case enables individuals to look at Michael Phelps and say, oh, that's Michael Phelps. And then within half an hour, realize I'm not a 28-time Olympic medalist, but I've given up a lot for my success. Why did I do that? How can I help others think through these things? I like this case because it's different. It's not about a business topic per se, but it enables conversations that are very important to business. Vladimir Klitschko's story is one of post-career reinvention. So his boxing career is winding down. He has added a mental health coach to his squad after a terrible defeat to Lehman Brewster. And he wishes to use what he has learned in boxing to help managers build more resilient organizations. The case is about that process of having a new career. How do you transition post-retirement into a different line of work? How do you give back? So both of these individuals, I think, taught me a lot about how they view the world and how they talk about topics that can be very difficult for very high achievers to talk about.
You did this wonderful series of cases on Christiane Lagarde. I was wondering how those came about.
Professor Julie Battilana also has a dual appointment at the Kennedy School. So she's very interested in leaders in the public sector, but also in the private sector and on career evolution. We worked on this case with some students who were working with her. And the idea was to track the evolution of a leader through these various inflection points and also to portray a leader in a very honest way. And it was absolutely fantastic to work with Madame Lagarde because she was open to sharing that she doesn't sleep much, for example, which enables her to be a great negotiator because she can stay up longer than everybody else. And so she shared some elements of her personal life. She was a champion synchronized swimmer, so she understands how hard it is to actually get people to move in unison. So it's a case series. It has various stages. And it works. I think it works very well in the classroom. It talks about the difficult decisions that she had to face in 2008 and as finance minister, and now, of course, in her current position. It was a treat to work on that case with Professor Battilana and the students.
Did you actually have to travel to interview them? Do you go with the faculty member? Is there a team that works on this, or is it more ad hoc?
So usually we travel. So both of these happen to be in the pandemic, in part because the faculty member wanted to be sure that these topics would be available for discussion. So we did these interviews remote, but typically, yes, travel is involved, especially abroad. It's important for people you get a very different feeling from walking through a factory in Kuala Lumpur than you have by Zooming with the factory managers. So it's interesting. You asked about my favorite cases. The two most recent ones are proximate and close to my heart, but I did a case on a real estate company years ago, and we visited very different locations, and it was about how challenging it is to run satellite offices. And every single satellite office I visit was completely different, absolutely completely different. You would have taken the sign off the door. I would have had no idea it was the same company. They didn't speak the same way. They didn't have the same strategy. And so the case reflects what you pick up in the field. So yes, we try to visit. It's a very different feeling. You might have the time to go to dinner with people there. So usually it's the protagonist and then a faculty member and sometimes a faculty co-author.
And how does the case evolve during that 3-month period? How much time is the team actually spending together discussing this and updating it?
So it depends. I think I mentioned, so we would do interviews, let's say a day and a half. You would caucus with the faculty around how you wish to write it. They might have an outline. They might wish you to develop an outline. It's not quite individual. Then the RA would step aside and probably produce a first draft. The faculty member would review the first draft. You would meet with the person. Hopefully, a second draft will be good enough to send to company. The company will review. Then there'll be another round of edits. So it's fairly iterative over these 3 months. We keep track of our time. It's 3 or 4 weeks of solid work.
And how is a case tested before it's published? Do you have outside readers? Is there a group process to edit the case and get it prepped for the class?
Cases get submitted into publishing, and then there's a compliance and a legal review. And then once it is in the system, then the faculty can use it. So usually it's restricted to HBS use. A case will be used in class. There'll be revisions. Because once you teach a case, you realize unfortunately, there are sometimes typos. We do our best to avoid them. Maybe something wasn't clear to the students. If a student said, I wasn't quite clear about, you might wish to clarify that. Faculty may realize that there's an entire paragraph on something that never came up, so that might be taken out. The edits can only be editorial or take materials out. If any material is added, then we would need the permission of the company. And then once everything is clean, it's clear legal review, we've had permission to use the data that is in the exhibit, then it would be available for outside sale, and then it would be sold.
I was just thinking more in publishing, they have read it. They send out an academic book to read just to get notes, that kind of thing.
Some faculty member might incorporate that in their practice. I don't know. But the other thing to think about is that when we talk to companies, as I mentioned, it's really an exercise in trust and mutual support. And what they tell us is confidential. The information that you see in cases has been approved by the company. The 100 slides that they sent me for me to look at before I picked that one slide that I included in the Carlyle case, for example, they've approved. Nobody else has seen the other 99 slides, nor have I discussed with anybody else what was in these 99 slides. And people didn't know that I was writing about Carlyle until the case was released. We take the confidentiality very seriously.
And how did that Carlyle case go? Didn't it change in the middle?
Well, so we were there, yes, at dramatic times in October 2008. And what was most astonishing to me is that once the day started, we went through our 8 interviews, one after another. Clearly, they had other things to do than talk to us. But there too is testimony to also how seriously case companies take this engagement with Harvard Business School, that they wish to stay and engage with the faculty member at the time. And there was a little bit of a discussion about the meltdown happening, but for the most part, we were focused on the case and the task at hand. So that might have been one of the most dramatic cases from a timing standpoint. And that was very efficient. We were there for, I think, a day and a half. And everybody we talked to was extremely clear. Sometimes you do cases on startups where people are less trained to speak on the record. There might be more teasing out. So again, every case is really very different. When you read the cases, they feel so formulaic because you'll have a background, you'll have an action, you'll have a question at the end, you'll have exhibits. So the writing itself feels technical, but there's a lot of humanity and emotion in how you get there.
And how long does it take a person to learn how to write a case properly?
I would say forever. I feel that I learn every single time. The only thing that I say when we do case writing training is that at some point in the case writing process, you're always in a dark tunnel. And you're like, how did I get here? I'll never make it out. What the heck? I should have organized this differently. I didn't ask this question. The faculty is going to be upset. And the only real difference between people who start writing cases and a person like me is that I know that I've made it out of the tunnel 200 times before. I'll probably make it out of the tunnel. But there's always a part of panic, which is there's so much material. You know what the faculty wants. It's not easy to write. It's not easy to write in stressful times, frankly. I feel this with our team. People are very distracted about politics and everything that is happening in the world and conflict. So the act of writing has become, I think, also more challenging. What we do in our team is that so people go to case writing training, which is the theory, and then they're paired with a senior mentor. And so they will go through the entire process. So we do that in order to train people, but we also do that in order to make sure that we don't train the people at the expense of the client, which is here the faculty member. The faculty member needs to make sure that they'll have a high quality product at the end. So we never assign newcomers directly. After about 2 or 3 cases, maybe 6 months, we say, why don't we staff you on a solo case? Usually it's a relatively straightforward case with a faculty member who is, of course, the faculty members are always updated, are willing to accept and help. And they understand that they need to help us train case writers because case writers go on to do other things. And I would say between 6 to 1 year, you know what you're doing. And then you will wind up with a case that you really struggle with. And you'll be reminded that this isn't as easy as it looks. There's perpetual learning. And in my team, you'll find that there are people who have been doing this for decades like me. And there are some people who come for 2 or 3 years and then they go to law school and they do something else. But even the old timers, we all still struggle to serve the faculty the best we can. We really do. And if we didn't struggle, we wouldn't stay. It wouldn't be interesting.
We talked about this before with Paul Edelman. He's looking for people who can take a lot of noise and pick the signal out of it. And that takes real cognitive effort. And doing it over time and trying to get it right on paper, it's very difficult.
That's exactly right. And actually, it's funny you mentioned Paul because it was one of your interviews that I liked. I really liked his sort of frame on how can you tell how people do under pressure and how do you support individuals as they go through the process of learning. So one challenge with the workplace that is not challenging enough is that people don't develop. So when I use the term struggle, you use the term traumatizing. From struggle and trauma with the right supports, we can emerge stronger, which is actually exactly what the Klitschko case is about, which is what resilience is. And I think those of us who are case writers and love it, like the challenge of it. And there's a lot of cognitive sort of choices to be made. Same thing in the classroom, by the way. The students have to make a choice about what is important, when to speak, how to build on each other's topics, break through the noises there.
So HBS Publishing is a very successful business in its own right. How does the case program fit in with the larger effort?
So it is one of publishing, I believe, has 3 divisions. The cases are sold through the higher ed division, and it's part of their business. When we are done with the case, it gets submitted into this review process that I mentioned, the legal read, and then it gets sent to publishing, sells and markets the cases. So it's important. It's a very big part of their business, for sure. They also support simulations, they sell teaching notes, a lot of things that are related to the cases themselves. They work with partner schools, folks who buy our cases. We get feedback from them around what works, what doesn't work. So they have a very important connection to the market that they feed back to the institution. And sometimes they're partners in innovation, which is maybe we should have slightly shorter formats. Maybe we should be thinking of writing cases that would be easier to access to an undergraduate audience, for example. So they're partners not just in sales, but also in innovation.
So this is such a niche of a niche. I'm curious, is there any effort to think about things like market share? Because obviously there are other business schools who write cases as well.
So you're asking what is our market share relative to the overall production of case studies?
Yes.
Huge, I would say. You would have to look at the numbers and you'd have to figure out a lot of things also present as case studies, right? So people sometimes reach out to me. We do a lot of outreach to other schools who want to start case programs. And they're like, oh yeah, we're going to write a description of somebody and they're going to be 3 pages long and that'll be a case study. And that may be right. And the original case studies from the law school in the 19th century, Dean Landell started, and it was really, oh, here's a situation, let's discuss. But I think case studies, as I understand them, which are relatively long, involve interviewing. Not that many schools do a lot of these. So I would say that we're still in the 90%, but we would have to look up the data.
Why does it dominate the market share?
So I think in part is because of the unbelievable investment that the schools put into cases. They take a long time to write. As we've discussed, they take a lot of faculty focus.
And I understand these are never sponsored. This is paid for entirely by the school.
Yes, we pay for all the travel. And just on time, Joe, one of the biggest surprises that I had. So I started off as a research associate to one of my faculty members, Michael Yoshino, who basically invented the field of international strategy. And this is at the time of bearskins and stone knives. He calls my voicemail at work at 4 a.m. and asked me a question about one of his cases. I trundled in at 8:30, listened to my voicemail, totally panicked that my faculty member called and I wasn't there. He's already in class. And after class, I said, you wrote this case. What are you doing at 4 a.m? And he says, I'm prepping for the class. And I realized that in order to teach by the case method, the faculty member has to have absolute control or relative control of case facts. So when you think of what an investment that is for you, Joe, if you were a faculty member, which is not only do you go in the classroom thinking, what am I teaching? What's going to be on my board? Where will I be at 13 minutes after? Because then I know that I have 7 minutes to get to my next question so that I can finish at 45. And then you need to be able to tell when a clever whippersnapper in class says, according to footnote 6, the margin is 2x. Faculty will say, well, actually, it's footnote X, but footnote 8, and the margin is 3x. But I'm glad you read the footnotes. So the amount of investment that it requires and commitment of the faculty to create wonderful case method learning environments is tremendous. And so I think in part, the business school, Harvard Business School, remains talented and prolific in case writing because of the investment it makes to the method and the commitment that it has to it, which was the beginning of our conversation.
Are the professors trained in the case method?
So the faculty members work with mentors. When they're new, sort of incoming senior faculty members will partner to teach about the art and science of case writing. And then after they've done sort of work on their own, then they might have access to research support from our team or from individual RAs or from our overseas offices.
So I always remember that there was a bit of a friendly cross-river rivalry there, where the various schools believed that their methods were the best and that the business school wasn't a real discipline. Can you make a case for the case method?
I'm not sure that I need to make a case for the case method because we have empirical evidence that it works. It helps faculty develop. It's good for the practitioners. It's good for the classroom. It's training people that have value in the marketplace. As MBAs, we use it in medicine. It's used in nursing. It's used in social work. It's used in law. So I think the importance to enable individuals to discuss situations that aren't exactly related to them, but then they realize that they're related to them, is super powerful. And so I think the participant-centered learning, the humility that comes from realizing that you have a lot to learn from others, the humility that comes from understanding that contrary points of view are important. So if you think of our democracy today, the case method really exhibits what is the best possible outcome, which is a decision has to be made where people usually disagree. That's a productive case discussion. And after you'll be like, wow, at first when Joe said this, I said, what does Joe know? And then I was like, wow, that was actually pretty clever. So maybe next time I'll listen more to Joe. Or what Joe said sounded clever, but actually that was bullshit. And I think next time I'll counter-argue a little bit more efficiently. So you learn how to become a more engaged participant in conversation, which is really what we need now in civic society. So I don't think I need to make a case for the case method. I think you bring us back to like early history, which is at the beginning of the business school. It's called the delicate experiment, which is basically a group of faculty members get together. Industrialization is upon us, railroad management, and they say, we need to study business. And the folks on the other side of the river said, this is not really a discipline. So why don't you go and think about it for a little while? Then they got exiled to the swamp that was what is now the business school campus. And they toured around, kept on going, got a lot of money from the bakers. All that history has been written. I think the fact that there's rivalry is wonderful because we want to learn from people from different sectors who have different points of view. Actually, one of my favorite cases to have written also is one with somebody who was at the School of Public Health. They view the world in a completely different way. And when you look at where evolution has occurred in the past, it's in biochemistry, it's in social economics, it's in behavioral economics. So everywhere where I think disciplines come together and there's a little bit of the friction we discussed, and you realize that there's a lot to learn in how different people approach things, is a wonderful learning opportunity. We learn a great deal from the team at the Kennedy School. They don't have release forms. So they have a very different relationships to the people that they interview, which is interesting for me to think about. I've partnered with folks at the Bloomberg City Leadership Initiative to write cases for mayors.
What do you mean they don't have release forms?
There are some business schools also that don't have an authorization card at the end. They interview people on record and they will choose their quotes so that it's closer to a journalist or an analyst report. It's just a different way of doing things. The Bloomberg folks are extremely methodical. They have a discussion note for everything. Working with them was completely different than how I'm used to working. And that's how we learn. So I'm all for differences and rivalries. I really am.
So there's best-selling cases, but do you ever survey the students and find out what favorites they have?
By the end of a class, I believe that a survey is extended to the students to have them rank cases. And sometimes it's challenging. You can have a case that is not great, but a phenomenal teacher, so the class will be great. And sometimes you have a great case and the teaching plan just didn't work. The feedback has to be tempered. But yes, the cases are ranked. And sometimes we have faculty reach out and say, oh, your case was the highest ranked in my course. I have to tell you. Unfortunately, they don't reach out to us to say your case was the lowest ranked and it was terrible. I would much rather learn about that because then we could collectively learn. So we don't get much of the negative feedback. But the faculty, yes, the students are asked.
Are there any particular favorites that come to mind?
At reunions, people will say, I still remember the so-and-so case. So there's some crowd favorites that remain. And then there are cases like the Southwest case, Benihana. They're all iconic. They've been used so often by so many people that a lot of people who have MBAs, when people reach out to me on LinkedIn, they're like, oh, I did the Benihana case. And then my heart warms up and people have sort of these emotions to cases that they have done. There are classic cases who have been around a long time who sell very well. Then there are recent bestsellers. So HBP has a lot of that data for your listeners if they're interested. And if there's a case that they're particularly interested in, they can reach out to me if they wish to discuss it.
Carin, thank you so much for joining us today and sharing your wonderful insights.
It was such a pleasure. Thank you so much for asking about all my babies.